In the world of aviation, every takeoff carries a promise. The promise of reaching safely, of returning home, of life continuing as planned. But sometimes that promise is shattered in an instant. I'm Jhon, and this is Plane Crashed, where we uncover the haunting stories behind history's most tragic air disasters. In the last 25 years alone, some of the deadliest plane crashes have not only claimed hundreds of lives, but also changed the course of aviation forever. Tonight, we revisit two of them, catastrophes that stunned the world, exposed hidden flaws, and forced the skies themselves to rethink safety. The night of May 31st, 2009, began like any other for Air France Flight 447. A routine transatlantic journey from Rio de Janeiro to Paris. On board were 228 souls, passengers and crew from across the globe. Many returning home, others embarking on new adventures. The Airbus A330 lifted smoothly into the humid Brazilian night, its engines humming against the dark expanse of the Atlantic. For the first few hours, everything seemed perfectly normal. The aircraft climbed to its cruising altitude, the cabin lights dimmed, and passengers settled into the rhythm of a long-haul flight. But somewhere over the equatorial Atlantic, between the borders of radar coverage and the limits of human control, something went terribly wrong. The air was thick with turbulence as the plane approached the intertropical convergence zone, a vast belt of storms that stretch around the Earth's equator. Captain Marc Dubois, a veteran pilot with over 10,000 flight hours, had handed over control to his two co-pilots as he took a scheduled rest. The sky outside was pitch black, the only illumination coming from flashes of lightning flickering on the horizon. At 2:10 a.m., the aircraft entered a storm system dense with ice crystals. Almost immediately, the plane's airspeed sensors, known as pitot tubes, began to freeze. These small instruments were critical. They told the pilots how fast the aircraft was moving through the air. When they froze, they sent conflicting data to the flight computers. Suddenly, the autopilot disengaged, leaving the crew to fly manually through one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. Inside the cockpit, alarms blared and warnings lit up the displays. The co-pilots, startled by the sudden loss of automation, struggled to understand what was happening. One of them, Bonin, instinctively pulled back on the control stick, trying to lift the plane's nose higher to fight the perceived drop in altitude. But in doing so, he set in motion a deadly chain of events. The A330 began to climb steeply, losing airspeed rapidly. Within moments, the aircraft's stall warning activated, a loud, repetitive tone that meant the wings were no longer generating enough lift to stay airborne. Yet in the confusion of conflicting instruments and flashing warnings, the crew did not recognize the danger. They believed the plane was overspeeding, not stalling. As the plane continued to climb, the air thinned and its speed dropped further. At 38,000 feet, the aircraft entered a full aerodynamic stall. The nose was too high, the engines roared in vain, and gravity began to pull the jet down into the dark Atlantic. For the next 3.5 minutes, the plane fell silently from the sky. Passengers in the cabin would have felt the eerie sensation of weightlessness, unaware of what was unfolding in the cockpit. The pilots, disoriented and fighting a losing battle against the instruments, kept pulling back on the controls. Despite repeated stall warnings, they never realized they needed to push the nose down to regain lift. The Airbus was descending at a terrifying rate, over 10,000 feet per minute, yet its nose remained high, pointed defiantly toward the heavens as it plummeted toward the ocean. At 2:14 a.m., the aircraft's last automated message was transmitted via ACARS, an onboard data system. It reported multiple system failures, cabin pressure problems, electrical faults, and the loss of flight control functions. Then silence. Air France 447 disappeared from radar screens, leaving no distress call, no trace, only questions. When the plane failed to arrive in Paris the next morning, panic spread. Families gathered at the airport, staring at the arrival boards, waiting for updates that never came. Within hours, search and rescue teams from France, Brazil, and several other countries were deployed across thousands of square kilometers of open ocean. The task was immense. The plane had vanished over one of the deepest and most remote parts of the Atlantic. In the days that followed, bits of debris and bodies began to surface, carried by ocean currents. It was a grim confirmation that Flight 447 had indeed gone down. But the cause remained a mystery. Without the black boxes, investigators could only speculate: a lightning strike, a catastrophic mechanical failure, or perhaps a mid-air explosion. The truth would take years to uncover. For nearly 2 years, teams scoured the ocean floor using sonar, submarines, and deep-sea robots, but the wreckage eluded them. The black boxes, somewhere nearly 4,000 meters below the surface, were silent witnesses to the tragedy, waiting in the dark. It wasn't until May 2011 that a French submarine finally located the main wreckage and recovered the flight data recorders. What they revealed was both shocking and heartbreaking. The aircraft had not been destroyed by weather or mechanical failure. It had fallen victim to confusion, training gaps, and human error in the face of cascading technical faults. The data showed that the pitot tubes had indeed frozen, causing the autopilot to disconnect. The co-pilots, suddenly thrust into manual flight in severe turbulence, were overwhelmed. They misinterpreted the loss of airspeed readings as an overspeed situation, not realizing that the aircraft was actually slowing down. When the stall warning sounded, they ignored it, assuming it was false. Instead of lowering the nose to recover lift, they continued to pull back on the controls, sealing the plane's fate. The captain, awakened by the chaos, returned to the cockpit, but by then it was too late. The aircraft was already in a deep stall, descending rapidly with little chance of recovery. Despite his efforts, there was nothing he could do. The final moments were recorded in haunting detail: the pilots' confusion, their desperate attempts to regain control, and finally, the impact with the ocean's surface at over 200 miles per hour. All 228 people on board were killed instantly. The aftermath of Flight 447 sent shockwaves through the aviation industry. Airbus and Air France faced intense scrutiny, and questions arose about how such an advanced aircraft could be brought down by something as simple as frozen sensors and human misunderstanding. Investigations revealed systemic issues in pilot training, particularly in handling high-altitude stalls and automation failures. Modern pilots, trained to rely heavily on autopilot systems, often lacked the manual flying skills once considered essential. The crash exposed the fragile balance between human and machine, a reminder that even the most sophisticated technology can fail. And when it does, human intuition becomes the last line of defense. Air France 447 changed aviation forever. Pitot tubes were redesigned to withstand extreme conditions, and flight simulators worldwide began to incorporate new stall recovery scenarios. The tragedy also sparked a deeper conversation about automation dependency in modern cockpits, how pilots, surrounded by computers, sometimes lose the instinct to fly by feel. For the families of those on board, closure came slowly. Many had to wait years for the remains of their loved ones to be recovered. In Paris, a memorial was erected in their honor, a quiet reminder of the fragility of human life against the vastness of the skies. The wreckage, now resting in the depths of the Atlantic, serves as a silent testament to the lessons learned at such a devastating cost. Air France 447 was more than an accident. It was a moment of reckoning. It forced aviation to confront its over-reliance on automation and the human tendency to trust technology over instinct. It revealed how, in the chaos of failing instruments and alarms, even the most skilled professionals can become disoriented. But it also led to change, to safer designs, better training, and a renewed understanding that beneath the layers of systems and sensors, flying remains an art that demands awareness, intuition, and respect for nature's power. The legacy of Flight 447 endures not just in aviation manuals or black box data, but in the haunting memory of a jetliner that vanished into the night, taking with it 228 lives and leaving behind lessons that would shape the future of flight forever. The morning of October 29, 2018 began like any other in Jakarta. The sun rose over the bustling Indonesian capital, the air thick with humidity and the hum of early commuters. At Soekarno-Hatta International Airport, Lion Air Flight 610 prepared for departure, a brand new Boeing 737 MAX 8, barely delivered to the airline a few months earlier. The aircraft gleamed under the dawn light, its engines waiting to carry 189 passengers and crew on a short, routine flight to Pangkal Pinang, an island city to the north. To most on board, it was just another Monday morning. Businessmen, families, and crew members went about their routines, unaware that within minutes of takeoff, their flight would become the center of one of aviation's most shocking modern tragedies. As the plane lifted off the runway at 6:20 a.m., everything appeared normal. But within seconds, the pilots noticed something strange. The aircraft's instruments were showing conflicting airspeed and altitude readings. A stick shaker, a violent vibration that warns of an impending stall, activated on the captain's side, even though the plane was climbing steadily. Confusion spread quickly in the cockpit. The captain, Bhavya Suneja, an experienced Indian pilot, and his co-pilot, Harvino, tried to make sense of the situation. The airspeed indicators disagreed, the altitude readings didn't match, and yet the aircraft continued to pitch downward, as if some invisible hand was forcing its nose toward the sea. The pilots fought back, pulling on the controls to bring the nose up, but it kept pushing down again. What they didn't know was that an automated system buried deep within the plane's software, something called MKS, or Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, was quietly working against them. It'd been designed to prevent the plane from stalling, but a faulty sensor had tricked it into thinking the aircraft was climbing too steeply. In response, MCAS repeatedly commanded the plane's nose downward, assuming it was saving the aircraft, when in reality it was sealing its fate. The pilots, unaware of the system's existence, struggled desperately against its commands. For the next 11 minutes, a deadly tug-of-war unfolded between man and machine. The captain tried to counteract the nose-down commands by pulling back on the yoke, while the co-pilot attempted to assist, flipping switches and calling out warnings. The altitude fluctuated wildly as the aircraft pitched up and down like a roller coaster. The ground proximity warning system began blaring, "Don't sink, don't sink." But every time the pilots regained a few hundred feet, the system forced the nose down again. They were fighting software they didn't even know existed, buried beneath layers of Boeing's design secrecy. In the final moments, the captain handed control to the co-pilot while he searched through the quick reference handbook, trying to find a solution. But there was no mention of MCAS, no checklist for a system that Boeing had never fully disclosed. The plane was descending fast, the engines roaring at full thrust, the horizon vanishing beneath them. At 6:32 a.m., just 13 minutes after takeoff, Flight 610 slammed into the Java Sea at nearly 500 miles per hour. There were no survivors. Fishermen miles away saw a flash, heard an explosion, and watched as the sea swallowed the wreckage. Within hours, rescue boats arrived at the crash site, finding only floating debris. Life vests, twisted metal, passports, and fragments of the aircraft's fuselage scattered across the water. The world was stunned. How could a brand new jet, flown by trained pilots, fall out of the sky minutes after takeoff? Boeing's 737 had long been considered one of the safest aircraft in history, the workhorse of commercial aviation. The MAX series, launched just a few years earlier, was supposed to be its next great evolution. More fuel-efficient, quieter and technologically advanced. But in the wake of the Lion Air disaster, questions began to surface. Within days, investigators discovered that the plane had experienced similar technical issues the day before the crash. On its previous flight, the same aircraft had reported erroneous altitude readings and automatic nose-down inputs. That flight had only avoided disaster because an off-duty pilot riding in the cockpit jump seat recognized the problem and told the crew to disable the stabilizer trim system. But the issue was never fully resolved. Maintenance crews replaced a sensor overnight, assuming the problem was fixed. The next morning, that sensor's failure would doom Flight 610. As Indonesian investigators recovered the black boxes from the seabed, the true cause of the crash began to emerge, a mix of flawed design, corporate negligence, and a failure to train. The MCAS system, which had pushed the nose down repeatedly, relied on input from a single angle of attack sensor. When that sensor malfunctioned, MCAS activated based on false data, assuming the aircraft was climbing too sharply. Boeing had built this system to compensate for the new MAX engine placement, which altered the plane's aerodynamics. The company claimed it was a simple software fix that required no additional pilot training. In fact, Boeing had intentionally downplayed MCAS's importance, even keeping it out of pilot manuals to avoid expensive simulator sessions for airlines transitioning from older 737 models. The revelation sparked outrage. Pilots worldwide were stunned to learn that they had been flying aircraft with an automated control system they had never been told about. The design had effectively created a situation where a single faulty sensor could trigger a deadly feedback loop, and the pilots, left in the dark, had no idea how to fight it. As investigators pieced together the flight data, it became clear that the crew had done everything they could under impossible circumstances. They had followed procedures, communicated with air traffic control, and fought valiantly to keep the plane level. But they were battling a machine that didn't trust them. The crash sent shockwaves through the aviation world, but the true magnitude of Boeing's problem would only become apparent 5 months later, when another 737 MAX, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, crashed under eerily similar circumstances, killing all 157 on board. 2 crashes, 2 brand-new aircraft, 2 nearly identical failure sequences. The pattern was undeniable, and within days, aviation authorities worldwide grounded the entire 737 MAX fleet. Boeing's most successful program had become its greatest scandal. In the months that followed, investigations exposed a web of corporate decisions driven by profit, competition, and complacency. Boeing had rushed the MAX into production to compete with Airbus's A320neo, a rival aircraft that offered better fuel efficiency. To avoid the costly process of designing a completely new plane, Boeing modified the decades-old 737 design, fitting it with larger engines that changed its aerodynamics. MCAS was a software patch meant to make the new model handle like its predecessors. But instead of being a safety feature, it became a silent assassin. Internal emails later revealed that Boeing engineers and test pilots had raised concerns about MCAS long before the crashes. Some had questioned why the system relied on only one sensor, while others warned that it could activate too aggressively. But those warnings were ignored or buried. The company lobbied regulators to certify the MAX quickly, assuring them it was just another 737 with minor differences. The Federal Aviation Administration, under pressure to keep Boeing competitive, delegated much of the safety certification back to Boeing itself. The result was a perfect storm of negligence, oversight failure, and misplaced trust. As the world mourned the victims, Boeing faced a reckoning. Lawsuits poured in from families demanding accountability. Airlines demanded compensation for grounded fleets. Congressional hearings in the United States exposed a culture of cost-cutting and secrecy within Boeing's leadership. In one damning exchange, a Boeing test pilot described MCAS as running rampant in simulator tests years before the crashes. The company's CEO was forced to resign, and billions were paid out in settlements. The 737 MAX was grounded for nearly 2 years as engineers redesigned the MCAS system, adding redundant sensors and improved pilot training protocols. But for the families of the 189 passengers on Lion Air Flight 610, no technical fix could ever undo the loss. Each passenger had a story: a newlywed couple, a young mother with her baby, aid workers, and crew members who had trusted their aircraft to bring them safely home. In Jakarta, memorials were built by the sea, where fishermen still remember that morning when the horizon flashed and then fell silent. The Lion Air disaster was more than just a plane crash. It was a mirror held up to modern aviation, exposing the dangers of unchecked automation, corporate greed, and the erosion of pilot authority. It showed how the pursuit of profit and efficiency can overshadow the most basic principles of safety, and how a single line of faulty code can end hundreds of lives. Yet it also sparked change. The grounding of the MAX became a wake-up call for the entire industry. Regulators around the world re-examined their certification processes. Pilots demanded more transparency, and manufacturers were forced to confront the ethical weight of their decisions. Boeing, once synonymous with trust, faced the long road of rebuilding its reputation, an effort that would take years and forever change how the world viewed aviation safety. Lion Air Flight 610 serves as a haunting reminder that in the delicate dance between human skill and machine precision, balance is everything. Too much automation and the pilot becomes a spectator. Too little and human error takes control. On that October morning, both collided in a storm of confusion, silence, and tragedy. The legacy of that flight endures not just in memorial plaques or investigation reports, but in every cockpit where pilots are now trained to question the unseen systems that guide them. It stands as a lesson written in pain and loss, teaching the world that progress without humility can be deadly, and that even in an age of advanced technology, the ultimate responsibility for flight safety must always rest with those who command the sky in the end. Both Air France Flight 447 and Lion Air Flight 610 remind us that even in an era defined by innovation and automation, the skies remain a place where human understanding and machine precision must coexist in fragile harmony. These tragedies were not just mechanical failures or moments of confusion. They were stories of trust betrayed, lessons learned through heartbreak, and reminders that progress in aviation is written in sacrifice. Every reform, every new safety system, every hour of training that followed was built upon the memory of those who never made it home. Their loss reshaped the way we fly, pushing the industry